It all started on a Thursday afternoon that felt like any other. The sun was out, kids were laughing in the front yard, and I had just settled into my lawn chair with a cold iced tea and a book I hadn't touched in weeks. My youngest was chalking a hopscotch grid on the driveway, while the older two were playing tag across the grass. It wasn't chaos, it was childhood, and for once, everything felt simple. Then she appeared. From across the street came the unmistakable click of heels. I didn't even have to look up. That sound had become synonymous with doom in our neighborhood. And sure enough, there she was. Karen. Blazer neatly pressed despite the heat, HOA badge pinned to her lapel like she was running for sheriff. Her lips were pursed into that familiar mix of disapproval and false concern. She walked across my lawn without hesitation, clipboard in hand, like it was her sworn duty to bring order to this unruly corner of suburbia. "Hi there," she said, with that sing-song voice that only came out when she was about to deliver a warning wrapped in faux kindness. "We've had some concerns about the noise levels from your property." She glanced at the kids, who had now frozen mid-laugh. "It's just that several neighbors have mentioned it's been quite energetic over here lately." I blinked. "You mean the sound of children playing?" She smiled as if I were the one being absurd. "Well, yes. Of course, we all love the sound of joy and laughter, within reason. But lately it's been a bit much, especially during dinner hours. A few residents mentioned it's becoming disruptive." I could feel the heat rising in my face, not from the sun but from the absurdity. I tried to keep my voice calm. "They're just playing tag." Karen nodded solemnly, as if I'd confessed to letting them set off fireworks in the yard. "I understand, but there are community guidelines about maintaining peace and quiet, especially in shared spaces. Front yards are very visible, and sound carries." That was her angle, shared space. I knew she'd been pushing that phrase lately. To Karen, nothing was truly private if it could be seen or heard from the sidewalk. She started quoting a section from the HOA handbook, something about preserving the aesthetic tranquility of the neighborhood. I tuned her out after the first sentence. My kids stood awkwardly behind me, holding their chalk and basketball, confused and silent. The joy they'd been radiating only moments earlier had been snuffed out with a few carefully chosen words and a plastic smile. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a complaint. This was a warning shot, a way to remind us who held the imaginary gavel around here. Karen left with a satisfied nod, promising to follow up if necessary. As she clicked away down the street, I looked at my kids, still quiet, still unsure, and made a quiet vow. If she wanted to declare war over laughter, I was more than ready. But I wouldn't fight it with arguments or paperwork. I'd do it with joy, with color, with the very thing she hated most. She didn't know it yet, but the front yard she thought was too loud was about to get a whole lot louder. 3 days after Karen's unwelcome visit, a letter arrived in the mail, not an email. Not a knock on the door. A proper, printed, official-looking envelope with the HOA's logo in the top left corner, like it was a summons from the High Court of Suburban Rule Enforcement. It was sealed with the kind of importance usually reserved for jury duty or overdue taxes. I already knew what it was before I even opened it. Inside was a typed letter on faux stationery with all the charm of a traffic citation. "Dear resident," it began. No name, no greeting, just sterile bureaucratic formality. "It has come to our attention that excessive outdoor noise has been observed originating from your property during late afternoon hours. This activity has disrupted the quiet enjoyment of nearby residents." I couldn't help but laugh. Quiet enjoyment? That sounded like a phrase someone Googled under polite ways to say I hate kids. The rest of the letter was a vague threat, referencing community guidelines, noise ordinances, and a reminder that repeat offences could result in escalating fines and formal action. I pictured Karen sitting at her kitchen island, sipping sugar-free tea and typing this letter herself, probably with one hand while the other clutched her HOA manual like a Bible. She didn't sign it, just a cold HOA board. That was her style. Make it seem like everyone was behind her, like the whole neighborhood was just one unified front of people desperately trying to preserve the peace she'd appointed herself guardian of. That weekend, I attended the monthly HOA meeting, curious to see if this letter was the beginning of something bigger. I walked in with the letter folded neatly in my back pocket and a carefully rehearsed smile. The room was filled with the usual suspects: retirees with clipboards, parents too polite to protest, and a couple of new faces who looked like they'd wandered in by accident. And then there was Karen, sitting dead center at the head of the table like she was chairing a Senate subcommittee. When it came time for open discussion, Karen leaned into her mic like she was about to announce a state of emergency. "We've received multiple concerns," she said, voice sweetened with just enough saccharin to burn, "about recurring noise disturbances from front yard activities. While we all appreciate the value of outdoor play, we must remember that our community was built on principles of peace, respect, and mutual consideration." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Everyone turned slightly toward me, some with guilty expressions, others with practiced neutrality. One woman with a small dog on her lap leaned over and whispered something to the man next to her. Karen smiled faintly at me, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew what she was doing. This wasn't about the kids. It never was. This was about control, about reminding the block who ran things, who could write letters, call meetings, and define peace and quiet however she liked. I raised my hand, calm and steady. "Just to clarify," I asked, holding up the letter, "what exactly qualifies as excessive noise? Because if we're fining for laughter, then I think we've lost the plot." A few chuckles escaped from the back of the room. Karen's expression tightened, just for a moment, before snapping back into her default setting of polite indifference. "There's no need to be defensive," she said smoothly. "We're simply here to ensure everyone's living experience is enjoyable." She said enjoyable, like it came with a trademark symbol. The meeting moved on, but the message was clear. My kids were now on the HOA watch list. Our front yard had become ground zero for what Karen called community disruption. That night, I looked out my window and watched her stroll past our house. She stopped briefly at our sidewalk, glanced over the lawn like she was measuring it with her eyes, and then kept walking. It wasn't a look of concern. It was a silent warning. And something about that gaze, so sure, so smug, made something shift inside me. If she thought a letter and a public shaming were enough to quiet us, she was about to find out how wrong she was. Karen hadn't always been the neighborhood tyrant. Or maybe she had, and we were just too slow to notice. It started small, like these things always do, little gestures that didn't seem worth challenging. A suggestion here, a reminder there, polite at first, helpful even. That was her specialty, disguising control as care. One of the earliest encounters I remember was about my mailbox. It was forest green, slightly chipped on the side, but it did its job. One morning, I found a sticky note pressed to it with a smiley face and a message in elegant cursive. "Just a heads up, mailbox color doesn't match HOA standards. Might want to consider repainting it. Love this neighborhood." No name, but I knew it was her. She was the only one who dotted her I's with little loops and signed off messages with faux affection. I let it go, figured it was harmless. A suggestion, nothing more. Then came the flag incident. My kids had made a homemade 4th of July banner out of red and blue handprints and hung it over the porch railings, It was festive, sloppy, joyful. But 2 days later, a letter arrived, another one from the HOA, reminding us about decor restrictions and visual uniformity. Again, unsigned. Again, suspiciously specific. We all knew who it was, but no one wanted to make a scene. Everyone just quietly complied. That was her power. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She smothered you with etiquette until you caved. Over time, the stories started to stack up. My next-door neighbor, a single mom named Jody, had a wooden wind chime on her porch that made the softest, most delicate sound when the breeze came through. Karen left a note taped to her door. We're all sensitive to certain sounds. Please consider the peace of others. Jody took it down the next day. Across the street, the Nguyens planted tulips in their front yard, vibrant reds and oranges. Karen left a pamphlet in their mailbox, highlighting the HOA's preferred color palette for landscaping, which, of course, conveniently excluded anything that bright. The flowers disappeared by the weekend. Then there was the saga with the Johnsons and their bird feeder. It attracted a few squirrels, as bird feeders tend to do. Karen complained that the squirrels were a pest risk and told them that feeding wildlife violated a rule buried deep in the HOA guidelines. They stopped refilling it. The squirrels left. Karen smiled more after that. At first I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, seeing patterns where there were none. But the turning point was the community Halloween party 2 years ago. We were decorating the front yard with faux cobwebs and cardboard tombstones when Karen came by with a camera. Not a phone, a real camera, with a zoom lens and everything. She took pictures of the decorations, then walked off without a word. 2 days later, the HOA issued a statement warning residents to avoid excessive displays of morbidity during family-friendly holidays. That was the first time I heard someone refer to her as the neighborhood censor. It was said in a whisper, but it spread fast. Looking back, it was all there. The power plays, the passive-aggressive enforcement, the way she wormed her way into everyone's business under the guise of caring for the neighborhood. We'd let her shape the rules, draw the lines, and decide what was acceptable. She didn't need a crown or a title. All she needed was the silence of a dozen tired neighbors, too polite or too afraid to push back. But silence has a shelf life, and mine was just about to expire. The day it all snapped wasn't stormy or dramatic. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that usually smells like coffee and pancakes and sounds like cartoons from the living room. The air was crisp, the kind of spring weather that practically begs you to be outside. So like clockwork, my kids wandered out to the front yard with a soccer ball and sidewalk chalk, ready to turn the driveway into their personal amusement park. They weren't loud, not by any real measure. They weren't screaming. They weren't fighting, just laughing, chasing, drawing spirals and suns across the cement. One of them had a Bluetooth speaker playing light music, some Disney song on low volume, cheerful and innocent. I was inside doing dishes, glancing out the window every so often just to check on them. Everything felt normal, until it didn't. I heard a voice, shrill, cutting through the glass like a buzzsaw. I knew that tone. It was Karen. I dropped the sponge, wiped my hands on a towel, and rushed to the front door. And there she was, standing on the edge of our lawn, both hands on her hips, lips moving with the kind of sharp precision that only shows up when someone thinks they're absolutely right. My youngest, who had been crouched by the sidewalk with a chalk bucket, was now standing frozen, head bowed. My daughter, a little older, looked stunned, the soccer ball resting still beside her foot. Karen's finger pointed toward the speaker. I stepped out onto the porch just as she shouted, "You children need to be more considerate. This is not a playground. This is a residential community." The moment she saw me, her expression shifted, but not by much. She tried to soften it, just barely. "Oh, I was just reminding them about the rules," she said, a condescending edge in her voice. "They're so young, they probably didn't realize they were disturbing the peace." Disturbing the peace. A 6-year-old drawing a sun and a 10-year-old kicking a foam soccer ball were apparently now threats to neighborhood tranquility. I walked down the steps and put myself between her and my kids. "They're just playing, Karen," I said, my voice measured. "They're not doing anything wrong." She tilted her head. "They were yelling. And that music. Well, it's a bit much for a Sunday morning, don't you think?" I looked at the speaker. It couldn't have been louder than a soft conversation. "It's not even 9 a.m., I replied. "And they're kids. You can't expect them to play in silence." Karen shrugged. "All I'm saying is, there are expectations in this neighborhood. Not everyone appreciates that level of energy first thing in the morning." With that, she turned and walked off, back straight, like she had just taught someone an important lesson. I turned back to my children. My youngest had tears in her eyes, chalk still clutched in her hand. "Did we do something bad?" she asked, voice shaking. And that was it. No policy, no fine, no HOA citation had ever hit me like that question did. My child, made to feel guilty for doing the most innocent thing imaginable, playing in her own yard, the space that was supposed to be hers, to be ours. I knelt down, pulled her into a hug, and looked over at my other two, their faces still shadowed with confusion. Karen had managed to do what no scraped knee or lost toy ever could. She had stolen the joy out of a morning that should have belonged to them. That night, as I tucked them into bed, they were quieter than usual. No requests for one more story. No giggling under the covers. Just silence. The kind that doesn't belong in a child's world. And that's when the decision settled in my bones, heavy and irreversible. If Karen wanted to declare war on joy, then I was done playing nice. I wasn't going to write a letter or file a complaint. I was going to build something so loud, so bold, and so gloriously fun that it would make every future complaint of hers sound like a joke. She wanted to erase laughter. I was going to plant it into the ground, bolt it into the soil, and make sure it echoed from one end of the street to the other. She made my kid cry. And that was her last free move. I don't remember exactly when the idea came to me. Maybe it was the sight of that sad chalk, drawing still clinging to the driveway days later, half washed away by the sprinklers. Or maybe it was the silence that hung in the air, like my kids had absorbed Karen's disapproval into their skin. Whatever the trigger was, it lit something inside me. Something stubborn, something fierce. I couldn't stop thinking about that smug look on her face, that pointed finger, the way she spoke to them like they were intruding on their own home. And then I thought, what if I didn't just push back? What if I turned the volume all the way up? At first, it was just a fantasy. I'd imagined turning our yard into something outrageous. A circus, maybe. A bounce house that never deflated. A karaoke machine with massive speakers pointed straight at Karen's front porch. But the more I thought about it, the more the fantasy sharpened into a plan. I didn't want to create chaos. I wanted to create joy. The kind that Karen couldn't silence, couldn't regulate, and definitely couldn't ignore. A playground. Not some plastic slide in the backyard, hidden behind hedges. I wanted a full playground, in the front yard, where everyone could see it, where the sound of laughter and play would drift over the sidewalk and across the cul-de-sac, where Karen would have no choice but to witness everything she tried to bury under HOA guidelines come bursting to life in brilliant, unapologetic color. That night, I stayed up late at the kitchen table with my laptop, poring over HOA bylaws and city zoning ordinances like I was preparing for trial. I wasn't looking to break the rules. I wanted to walk right up to the line and plant a flag on it. Turns out the front yard was fair game, so long as no permanent structures exceeded a certain height, didn't block sidewalks, and were aesthetically harmonious with the neighborhood. That last part was subjective, and I was counting on that. I kept digging. Swings, legal. Freestanding slide, also legal. Rubber mulch, no problem. Climbing dome. It fell within height restrictions. I took notes, made diagrams, even measured out the space between my porch and the sidewalk with a flashlight between my teeth. The more I planned, the more excited I became. This wasn't just a retaliation. This was going to be a celebration. The next morning, I drove to the nearest outdoor play equipment store. I walked through aisles of bright blue monkey bars and forest green tunnels, my imagination running wild. I pulled out my notebook with the dimensions and pointed at what I wanted. That swing set, I said. That rock wall. That spiral slide. And do you guys deliver? They did. Within a week. Back home, I ordered a dump truck's worth of mulch, rented some power tools, and started drafting my weekend war plan. I called a few buddies, handy, reliable, the kind who actually owned levels and work gloves. Most of them laughed when I explained the plan, but every single one agreed to help. One of them even offered to DJ the opening day, just to really annoy the fun police. I looked at the yard that night from the sidewalk, hands in my pockets, and imagined it full. Of kids swinging, laughing, running across a small wooden bridge I hadn't even built yet. I imagined Karen standing across the street, unable to stop it. Not with a note, not with a letter, not with a rule book. This wasn't just revenge. It was restoration. Taking back the space she tried to claim with complaints and clipboards. I wasn't just going to make noise. I was going to build something permanent, something joyful, something she couldn't shut down with a signature. She'd wanted my kids to be quiet, so now they were getting their own kingdom, right in her line of sight. Saturday morning arrived like a shot of adrenaline. I was up before the sun, lacing my boots and sipping coffee like I was preparing for battle. The front yard was empty, quiet, just grass and a few garden gnomes watching passively from the mulch bed. But in a few hours, it would become a construction site, and those gnomes were going to witness a transformation Karen would never forget. The truck arrived at 8:03 a.m., right on schedule. A flatbed loaded with playground equipment, shiny metal bars, colorful plastic slides, a swing set still in pieces, rumbled down the street, tires crunching against the asphalt. The driver stepped out with a clipboard and a grin. "You the guy building the fun zone?" he asked. I nodded, and the grin widened. "Nice. Been a while since I delivered one of these up front. Usually folks try to hide them out back." I smiled. Not this time. By 8:30, my friends started showing up. Greg brought donuts. Mason hauled a tool chest that looked like it had its own zip code. Even Jody from next door brought over a folding table and a jug of lemonade. She gave me a quiet thumbs up. No words needed. The neighborhood wasn't just watching. It was quietly rooting. By 9 a.m., we were unpacking the parts and sorting bolts by size. The first swing post was already being measured for placement when I noticed the first curtain twitch across the street. Karen's house, her front window. I didn't even have to see her face to know she was there. She was always there when things didn't go according to her plan. She didn't come out right away. Instead, she watched as we erected the climbing dome, its bright red and blue bars catching the sunlight. When the second truck arrived, this one carrying mulch and safety mats, Karen finally emerged. She stood at the end of her driveway in a bathrobe and sandals, holding a coffee cup like a security badge. "Excuse me," she called out, loud enough for the whole block to hear. "Is there a permit for this?" I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand and walked over, calm as a monk. "City says it's fine, as long as it doesn't exceed 6 feet in height and stays within our property line." I gestured toward the measuring tape we had stretched along the curb. "Everything's within regulation, HOA can't stop front yard improvements unless it violates aesthetic standards, and fun isn't listed as a violation. She blinked, clearly not expecting a legal answer. But this is excessive. It's an eyesore. Beauty's subjective, I replied. Some people like flowers. Some people like freedom. Her mouth opened and closed. No rebuttal. She turned and walked away without another word. The real fun began after lunch. The slide went up. The monkey bars were secured. The swing set took a bit of time to level, but once it was anchored, it stood like a monument to resistance. By mid-afternoon, the front yard looked like a tiny public park, and the sound of drills and laughter had drawn an audience. A couple of neighborhood kids drifted over, drawn by the siren song of bright plastic and dangling swings. I waved them in. "Can we play?" one of them asked shyly. "Be my guest," I said. "Test it out." Within minutes, the place was alive. Sneakers pounded mulch. The swings creaked with motion. Chalk returned to the driveway, new colors blending over the old, and laughter filled the air like a soundtrack of rebellion. Karen came out again just as a kid squealed with delight, launching himself down the twisty slide. She stood there, arms folded, mouth thin as a piano wire. The best part, I hadn't even planned a grand opening. This was just construction day, a test run, but the neighborhood didn't care. They saw joy, and they followed it. Around 5 p.m., I stood on the porch, sipping a fresh glass of lemonade, watching it all unfold. Parents waved from sidewalks. One of the older residents even gave me a slow clap as he walked by. I nodded in return. That night, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange, I turned on a few solar-powered garden lights I'd stuck around the yard. They flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the structure. Karen's window was dark, but I knew she was still watching. She had tried to silence a few kids. I'd answered with an entire playground, and we were just getting started. The official grand opening was never actually planned. It wasn't announced, posted, or printed on any invitation. It just happened. Like something that had been bubbling under the surface of the neighborhood finally broke through. The next Saturday, I dragged a cooler full of sodas onto the porch, set up a Bluetooth speaker, and planted a handmade sign at the edge of the lawn that read, "Welcome to the fun zone. Shoes optional, laughter required." By 10 a.m., the front yard was alive. Kids came first, as they always do. The ones from next door, the ones from 3 houses down. Even the shy ones who usually stuck close to their porches wandered over with cautious curiosity. Within minutes, the climbing dome was a jungle gym of tangled limbs and squeals. The swings pumped back and forth like pendulums of defiance. Someone had brought a foam ball, and a spontaneous game of tag broke out between the monkey bars and the sidewalk. Parents followed. At first, they stood at the edge, holding travel mugs and smiling like it was all too good to be true. But then someone brought a bag of chips. Someone else laid out a picnic blanket. Jody set up a folding table with lemonade and cookies. It became something bigger than I'd imagined, a pop-up neighborhood gathering that felt as natural as sunshine after a storm. And of course, right on cue, Karen appeared. She didn't march across the street this time. She stood in her driveway with her arms folded and her sunglasses on, like she was trying to ward off the joy with sheer force of will. Her lips moved silently as she counted children, then scanned for violations like a TSA agent at a parade. She paced the sidewalk twice, phone in hand, typing furiously. I had no doubt there were emails flying out in real time. Urgent complaints about noise levels, safety hazards, unsanctioned congregations. But no one listened this time. No one followed her lead. They were too busy living. At one point, a toddler tripped and scraped a knee. His dad scooped him up, kissed the bruise, and the kid was back on the slide in 2 minutes. No lawsuits, no sirens, just parenting. A woman from 2 streets over came up to me with a paper plate full of brownies and said, I don't know what you're doing here, but don't stop. I smiled and took a brownie. Even the neighborhood dogs seemed happier. A golden retriever named Toby laid in the shade of the jungle gym, tail wagging lazily as kids stepped over him. Someone brought sidewalk chalk again, and soon the driveway was covered in bright drawings, smiley faces, suns, rocket ships, and one oddly detailed dragon labeled Karen Slayer. Around noon, Mason showed up with a small pop-up canopy and a speaker stand. Figured we needed music, he said, grinning. We kept it light. Oldies, acoustic guitar, nothing aggressive. Just the kind of music that makes lemonade taste colder and sunlight feel warmer. Karen called the HOA president by 12:15. I know this because the president himself strolled over around 12:45, looked around, and shrugged. Looks like a happy neighborhood to me, he said. Just keep it safe, all right? I nodded, and he wandered off with a soda in hand. Karen stood frozen on her porch, stunned that her cavalry had not only refused to charge, but had joined the picnic. The real chaos came in the best possible way. Someone brought water balloons. It wasn't long before a full-on splash war erupted. Squeals of delight, screams of mock horror, and shrieks from parents caught in the crossfire echoed down the block. A balloon hit me square in the back, and I turned just in time to see my own daughter giggling behind the cooler, hands wet, eyes sparkling. I grabbed a handful of balloons and chased after her, laughter spilling out of me in ways it hadn't in years. In the background, Karen stood like a statue, still, speechless, powerless. By mid-afternoon, the yard looked like a summer camp and smelled like sunscreen and sugar. No one wanted to leave. No one felt the need to whisper or glance over their shoulder. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood didn't feel watched. It felt free. When the sun began to dip and the crowd started to thin, the kids lingered. They wanted one more swing, one more slide, one more race down the driveway. The parents stayed too, reluctant to return to whatever quieter, colder space they'd come from. We cleaned up together, gathered wrappers, packed up chairs, and wiped the lemonade table. Karen had retreated by then, curtains drawn, house dark. But even if she couldn't see us anymore, the sound remained. Echoes of laughter, the creak of swings, the distant splash of a balloon hitting concrete. Joy, loud and untamed, had planted itself right outside her window, and it wasn't going anywhere. By Monday morning, I could feel the shift in the air. The weekend had been a celebration, a statement, a triumph. But I knew Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds and move on. She was the type who built entire personalities around grudges, who saw public joy as a personal attack. Sure enough, when I opened my mailbox, there it was, a neatly folded envelope with the HOA logo and her fingerprints all over it. Inside was a formal request for compliance review. It cited a list of alleged violations, unapproved modifications to front-facing landscaping, unauthorized recreational structures, increased foot traffic disturbing community tranquility, and potential liability due to unsupervised minors on elevated equipment. It read like a lawsuit wrapped in floral-scented printer paper. The final paragraph warned that unless immediate changes were made to bring the front yard back into aesthetic harmony with the community vision, a formal disciplinary review would be held. It was signed by Karen, but this time she added, "on behalf of concerned residents." I chuckled as I folded the letter and placed it next to my coffee mug. Concerned residents? The same ones who were playing cornhole and sipping lemonade on my lawn 2 days ago? The same ones who brought brownies and thanked me for bringing the neighborhood back to life? She must have written the letter before the party, thinking it would be her knockout punch. But it was already outdated. The neighborhood had moved on. She hadn't. Later that day, I sent a short reply via email to the HOA board. I attached photos, pictures from the party, the kids smiling, the parents chatting. I included my research, zoning guidelines, and measurements of every single piece of equipment. I quoted their own bylaws, and at the end, I added, "The community seems more united than it's been in years." I respectfully declined to dismantle Joy. I didn't hear anything for 2 days. Then, on Thursday, I saw her again. She was pacing in front of her house, phone in one hand, a stack of papers in the other. She crossed the street and approached just as I was setting out the trash cans. "I've filed an appeal," she said sharply. "You'll be hearing from the compliance committee." I nodded, looking forward to it. Her eyes narrowed. "You think this is funny, don't you?" "I think it's community building," I replied. "You know, the kind that doesn't come with fines and threats." Karen muttered something under her breath and stormed back to her house. Less than an hour later, I saw her car leave the driveway and return with a man in a polo shirt carrying a clipboard. I recognized him. One of the HOA compliance officers. He stood on my sidewalk, nodded politely, and began taking notes. I greeted him with a copy of my paperwork, handed it over, and waited. He flipped through the documents, took a few pictures of the playground, measured the slide, then finally looked at me with a shrug. "Everything seems within the rules," he said. "Looks like a well-loved yard to me." I watched him walk back to Karen's driveway, her arms crossed like a stone gargoyle. They spoke for a minute, and then he got in his car and left. She didn't follow. She just stood there, looking at the yard, at the children who had now come out to play again as if summoned by fate. She had thrown her best shot, and it didn't land. The rules were on my side. The neighborhood was on my side. And Karen? She was running out of options, out of backup, and out of relevance. It didn't happen all at once. There was no announcement, no formal uprising. But slowly, steadily, like fog lifting after a long night, the neighborhood began to shift. It started with the small things. Waves from people who had once avoided eye contact. Smiles from those who used to pretend they didn't hear Karen's accusations. Now, they lingered longer during walks, stopped to chat near the swing set, or even dropped off snacks under the guise of just passing by. The silence that had protected Karen's reign was unraveling, thread by thread. One afternoon, as I raked mulch around the base of the climbing dome, Mr. Abrams from the corner house wandered over. He was a quiet man, the kind who always seemed to be trimming hedges or polishing his mailbox. I'd never had more than a nod from him in 5 years. But this time, he leaned on the fence and said, "That woman tried to fine me last spring for using the wrong shade of mulch." He chuckled, shaking his head. Who even notices things like that? Then, without waiting for a reply, he said, "Glad someone finally stood up to her." That was the first moment I realized it wasn't just about my kids. Karen hadn't just targeted me. She had spent years sowing seeds of quiet resentment across the block. People had complied because it was easier than arguing, easier than receiving another letter or another veiled threat. But now someone had refused to yield, and it gave everyone else permission to stop pretending. Jody from next door organized a lemonade stand with her daughter the following weekend, on her front lawn. Karen walked by 3 times, each pass slower than the last, until finally she stopped and tried to inspect the setup under the guise of checking for sidewalk obstruction. Jody, smiling like she'd been waiting for this moment, handed her a glass. "On the house," she said sweetly. Karen didn't drink it. She walked away in silence. By the following week, the change was unmistakable. Houses that had once conformed to every HOA bulletin suddenly sprouted personality. A neighbor painted her porch steps sky blue. Another added a garden gnome army by her flower bed. Kids were everywhere again. Sidewalk chalk contests, driveway basketball games, impromptu water gun battles. The playground had become a symbol, But the real revolution was in how people reclaimed their right to enjoy their own spaces. And Karen? Her voice got quieter. She still tried to hold meetings, still sent out long-winded emails citing obscure regulations. But now, the replies rolled in faster. One neighbor pointed out that the HOA handbook didn't mention inflatable pool toys, contrary to Karen's claim. Another asked where the money from last year's cancelled HOA barbecue had gone. Karen ignored that one entirely. Then, during a morning walk, I saw something that sealed the shift for good. A group of neighbors were chatting outside the clubhouse, laughing, relaxed. Karen approached, said something I couldn't hear, and was met with awkward silence. No nods, no smiles, just stillness. And then, slowly, they turned back to their conversation without her. She stood there for just a second, blinking in disbelief, then walked away alone. The woman who once controlled the neighborhood through fear and formality was now the one being ignored. Not hated, not fought, just dismissed. And that, I realized, was worse for someone like her than any argument or confrontation. The neighborhood had turned, not just against her, but toward something better, toward each other. And it all began with a playground built in defiance, rooted in joy. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and you could feel the anticipation in the air like the final act of a play. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs, half a dozen people arguing over trash pickup times, or whether decorative shutters violated the uniform aesthetic. But not this time. This time, folding chairs filled up 15 minutes before the meeting started. Neighbors who hadn't attended a single HOA gathering in years showed up with folded papers, manila envelopes, and, more importantly, stories. I arrived early with my folder tucked under my arm. Inside it were copies of everything: emails, bylaws, zoning codes, pictures of the playground, and Karen's many contradictory letters. But the most important item was tucked into the front sleeve, a printed copy of the letter she had taped to my door, demanding that I dismantle the swing set for violating community tranquility, signed in her distinct cursive, on behalf of the HOA. A letter that, according to the board's records, had never been reviewed or approved. Karen arrived 10 minutes late. She wore sunglasses indoors and carried herself like a celebrity ducking the press. She walked directly to the front, didn't make eye contact with anyone, and took her usual seat. Only this time, the seat beside her remained empty. The board members sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. But there was a current in the room, an unspoken consensus buzzing just beneath the surface. The president of the HOA, a man named Richard who had only recently taken the role, opened the meeting and launched straight into it. We're here due to ongoing concerns about recent HOA actions and communications. Specifically, issues surrounding community representation, authority over private property, and enforcement methods. He didn't say Karen's name, but everyone turned to her. She cleared her throat and stood. "If I may speak first," she said, with the poise of someone used to being heard. "There's been a lot of misinformation going around. This situation with the playground has been blown wildly out of proportion. My only goal was to preserve the peace and safety of our community. There are liabilities to consider: noise, unapproved construction, and frankly, certain residents have been stirring unnecessary drama." That was my cue. I stood, walked to the front of the room, and calmly opened my folder. I placed the letter she wrote next to a copy of the HOA's own correspondence policy. "This letter," I said, holding it up, "was taped to my door. It claims to represent the board. But when I contacted the HOA secretary, she confirmed it was never approved, discussed, or even seen. That's misrepresentation." I flipped to the next page. This is a photo from the community event she claimed to oppose. As you can see, Multiple board members attended. One of them even played cornhole. Chuckles rippled through the crowd. Then I brought out the emails. Neighbors thanking me for the playground. Parents noting how their kids now spent more time outside. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack. I just let the paper trail speak. Karen squirmed in her seat. One by one, residents stood to share their own stories. Mr. Abrams described the mulch citation. Jody recounted the wind chime crusade. Another neighbor held up a $75 fine for decorative lighting not consistent with seasonal themes, issued in May. By the time the president called for discussion, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. Karen's voice, once the loudest in the room, was now just background noise. The final motion came from the floor. I propose we remove Karen from the board for misconduct and misuse of authority. The vote wasn't even close, not a single hand raised in her defense. Karen stood slowly, gathering her things with shaky hands. She didn't argue. She didn't make a speech. She just walked out, her heels clicking against the tile in the quietest sound she'd ever made in that room. And as the door closed behind her, the entire meeting exhaled. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not the one who tried to control it. Victory didn't come with cheers or applause. It came with relief, and the kind of peace Karen had never truly understood. The following week, Karen's house went quiet. Not the smug kind of quiet she had always demanded from others, but a hollow, defeated stillness. Her porch lights stayed off. Her blinds, always angled to monitor the street, were now tightly shut, like the house itself didn't want to see the world anymore. A few days later, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn, crooked and leaning slightly, like even the ground beneath her had given up. She didn't speak to anyone after that. No apologies, no explanations, no bitter farewell notes. She packed up and disappeared one early morning, leaving behind a yard of trimmed hedges and over-regulated flower beds, and a neighborhood that finally exhaled. For the first time in years, the block felt lighter, like someone had opened a window in a long-locked room. The playground, meanwhile, took on a life of its own. What had started as a symbolic act of rebellion became a gathering place, a heartbeat for the neighborhood. On warm evenings, kids flocked to the swings and monkey bars. Parents chatted on folding chairs. Teenagers brought guitars and played under the stars. It wasn't just a space to play, it was a space to be. Free from judgment, free from scrutiny, free to enjoy something as simple and human as laughter. Neighbors who barely spoke before began organizing weekend potlucks and lemonade stands. Someone brought a projector one Saturday night, and we had our first outdoor movie screening. Blankets, popcorn, a big white sheet draped over the garage wall. The title of the film didn't matter. It was the spirit that counted. I added a small wooden sign near the entrance to the playground. Nothing flashy, just a plaque with carved letters that read, "This place was built with joy. Let it always echo." And it did. Every giggle, every squeaky swing, every slap of chalk against the pavement. It all echoed louder than any rule Karen ever tried to enforce. They say legacies are built through power or titles, but I learned that sometimes legacies are built with monkey bars and a stubborn refusal to be silenced. Karen wanted order. What she got was a monument to defiance. And as I sat on the porch one evening, cold drink in hand, watching a child shout, "Look at me!" from the top of the dome, I couldn't help but smile. In the end, she gave us the best thing she ever could have, something to push back against and a reason to come together.